including one I found from 1963 after Kennedy's address about going to the moon. And this article says, NASA to use LSD to train lunar astronauts.
Nice.
So
seems like it would make sense.
If that had happened, Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon, instead of saying some awkward test pilot kind of thing like one small step for man, would have stood there, meditated a moment on the whole totality, been there, saw the Earth rising, and he would have said to the camera, "Far out."
Yeah.
And the whole world, like 2 billion people watching, would have said, "Far out." It would have been a different world, but it still can be,
Okay, welcome to part 2 of episode 49 with Bruce Damer here on Adventures of the Mind. I am your host, James W. Jesso. We left on episode 1 on the touching at the origins of Western civilization and Western thought surrounding the Eleusinian mysteries, which was, well, I guess it's a mystery, so we don't know for sure, but the premise is that it was a psychedelic ritual that lasted for 1,000 years before ... calamity, which you will hear about in the story that emerges next with Dr. Bruce Damer. This is a bit of an interesting situation because Bruce, being a professional storyteller, really got into it and took me for a little bit of a ride, but I mostly am sitting silently that entire time. So instead of on YouTube having the sort of like side-by-side, face-by-face thing, there's going to be for a little while, it's just going to be Bruce's magical face, telling the story until it gets back to both of us chatting. So after we talk about the Eleusinian mysteries, we get into conversations about Bruce's other areas of work, which is basically space technology and his thoughts around where we're going with space technology and what it's going to be like when we get to Mars and start harvesting natural resources from asteroids and all these other things, as well as some direct questions that came from my patrons over on Patreon. Please enjoy episode 49, part 2 with Bruce Damer here on Adventures Through the Mind. Can you expand a little bit on Ulysses? In particular, I'm curious about the process of what we understand what the mysteries were and how long they lasted and why they stopped.
Well, the mysteries, I'm no expert on this, but Carl Ruck, who's a Harvard-based, I'm not sure he might still be alive, Harvard-based classicist, basically in a sense broke from the classicists of the day by going to Ulysses with Gordon Wasson and Albert Hoffman and studying the friezes, studying the temple, what's left of it. And they wrote this book called On the Road to Ulysses, and a second book, I think, called Persephone's Quest. So this guy is a serious guy. He's not a woo-woo type of thinker. He doesn't believe that pyramids are made by aliens or anything like that. So they really took a look at it and proposed that, in fact, the greatest mystery for the classicist world of people who study that era always was, what was the great mystery at Ulysses? That they had solved it and that it was a psychedelic initiation. Very, very powerful. And so very little is known about it because it was a mystery. It was a secret. There were harsh penalties for revealing what happened there. And this thing ran for 1800 years. This was a place where you, in later years, as long as you could speak some Greek, you could go. So you could be a fisherman, you could be a future Caesar, you could be Aristotle, and you could go to be initiated once in your life. Preferably, I think, on the earlier side. And so people traveled to Athens from all over the ancient world, and it was risky, to actually go anywhere. People sometimes didn't make it. And in Athens, for several months, they went through the lesser mysteries, and that's more is known about that. There were sort of bathings in the ocean. There were all kinds of rites, and there were diet had to change. You changed your diet. Your dress became very simple. You were identified by Athenians as initiates, and you were celebrated. And then one day, I think it was August or September, sort of at the harvest time, up to 1,000 of you marched up in a column up to this little bridge that Carthage couldn't go past because it was too narrow. It was meant for people passing into the threshold, into the plain of Ulysses. And when you crossed this bridge, you were crossing into the magic world, the world of the thresholds. And on either side of the bridge, the villagers from Ulysses would be there catcalling you, calling you names, criticizing you, so that if you were a nobleman, they would knock you down. They were trying to level the playing field. And then you went into the temple complex, which had this amazing sunken building called the Telesterion. And I think of this as the greatest story that's almost never been told, because 9 days in, after various things in the greater mysteries, everyone sat around the edges of the Telesterion. And what a name for a building, right? That's what it was called. And there was this huge ceremony. There was sonic vibration. The building was built to carry sound, almost like the Incans built. There was smoke, sound, and light show. There was lighting, and then the hierophants came in, and the women came in with these kind of great pots on their heads, twirling around, and they would serve this drink. And people would then sit and wait. And what they were waiting for is the return of Persephone from Hades, this daughter of the world that was going to bring the spring back to the dead world, bring life. And what came up was a light, this incredible light that people then contacted. And Plato wrote about it. And in his lifetime, he was accused of, through his work in philosophy, he was accused of revealing the mystery. So his very body of work, which changed all of human thought, was considered to be a revelatory of the mystery. That's pretty powerful stuff. So then people were opened. I mean, he described it as it's in the ineffable, basically, beyond words. And when they left, they were changed. They were turned into human beings from just kind of animalistic, young Turks. They were changed into human beings who had contact with this ultimate mystery. And then, so this went on through Rome. So Roman emperors got initiated. So you have some of the wisest emperors like Augustus or Claudius. And of course you had disaster areas like Nero. Maybe he was initiated, but didn't seem to do any good. And the Greece had built some of the greatest elements of civilization. Rome copied Greece and missed a few things. So Rome gradually became corrupted. Money corruption, kind of what you see happening in the world today, where money is buying influence, and the polity is failing. It failed in Rome. So by the 4th century, you had a almost full collapse of Western Rome, and the East was still somewhat strong. And you had this little thing called Christianity, which had come out of the Galilee and come north with Paul. There were branches of Christianity, and the branch that came out of the Galilee went north was kind of the intolerant branch. It was the apostles who Christ didn't even like them. Jesus didn't like these dudes. He liked Thomas because Thomas questioned things. He liked Mary Magdalene because he considered her his partner and equal. And he liked Judas. Judas was a cool dude who'd actually reached a form of enlightenment. He called Judas his twin. And of course, all three of these folks were demonized by the remaining apostles that Jesus used to harangue if you read the Nag Hammadi library, translated by Elaine Pagels. It's really funny Jesus just is constantly ratting these guys out, and like, you guys are trying to copy me. You shouldn't follow anybody. You haven't got it. You haven't got it. And so when Jesus left this mortal coil, these guys sort of grabbed the meme and went off in their own direction. And they ended up, hundreds of years later in Constantinople, and Constantine was converted. And his idea of Christianity was the sword, the flaming sword, and the cross. It was going to help him reestablish power, right? So it was a corporatized thing. And then they held these councils in Nicaea in Turkey. There were 4 of them, and they were really nasty affairs. I mean, people don't realize this, but the 4th century, you can read a book about the councils of Nicaea and how Christianity was fashioned by bureaucratic committee. This is why this is the greatest story ever told, because it explains the origin of the corporation and the state. So these councils of Nicaea are bureaucracies, and there was so much politics going on at one of them that bishops planted prostitutes in the room of a bishop to get him kicked out of the council. And then the Greek bishops and the Western bishops are arguing about one term for weeks, And finally, the Western bishops tell the Greek bishops that they will never come to agreement on a single word, because they're Greeks. And this is Greeks argue about one word. And then the Greeks accuse the Western bishops of this abomination of this Trinity idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which they consider to be completely nonsensical. And then they split. So you have the Eastern Orthodox Church and you have the Roman Catholic Church splitting. And so this entire so-called church fathers were kind of idiots, who were splitting hairs, and they were so far separated from the Logos. They were so far separated from what Jesus might have been, and that experience might have been that they created this corporatized, bureaucratized structure. So come 396 AD, and the 4th council has finished. And I'll just finish the story here, which is the Pauline Christians, which were described in the day by writers, Greek writers, as being black-robed, intolerant, binary thinkers. They set out from Constantinople, and on the road they met Alaric. And Alaric was a Germanic tribe's chiefman, a king really, who would come in and sack cities every couple of years. Just take them down. That was what they did. And he represented the old Europe, the Paleolithic, the uninitiated Paleolithic Europe. These guys represented the future, which was where they controlled initiation, and they decided what it was. And in fact, they didn't even offer initiation. They offered a faded substitute, and they paid Alaric coin to come with them to Ulysses and to smash the temple. And they did. And so Alaric's guys were like pretty strong dudes, and they just took it apart. So that's the state it's in now. So what these Christians were doing is to remove the competition and replace it. Instead of your right to contact the light or to meet God or whatever you might call it in your lifetime, they would say, no. This book that we control is your, what you must now fall down this rabbit hole. And we have a male hierarchy called a corporation that you shall pay taxes in, and you shall come and sit in rows in our things called a church, which is a completely alien thing. And then at death, when you pass this life, you might enter the kingdom of heaven and meet God if you follow all our rules, and we'll keep track of it. such a deal, you know. And then to initiate people in baptism, they just poured water over your head instead of immersing you to near-death experience, which was the original form of baptism, where you had a almost like a DMT opening to the light tunnel. That was what baptism was. So instead of that, they poured water over the baby's head until the baby cried. And they had this little round piece of bread, which they called the host, which actually was a kind of watered down, dumbed down version of the actual mystery, which could have been a mushroom, which really brought you into the light. So they craftily replaced all of that former stuff in order to make a simulation of the access of this powerful tradition that initiated civilization. So by replacing Eleusis and the mystery schools with this simulated system, they could dominate the world for the next 1,600 years, right? Pretty scary stuff. And even to the point where in the 14th century, they started to murder all the women that had sort of magical powers, calling them witches, burning people at the stake. It's one of the most diabolically evil things that has ever happened to human beings, the coming of Christianity. It really is. But poking up through it would be the occasional saint or mystic that would represent the power, perhaps, of what Jesus might have been about, or what the mystery schools were. And they would occasionally get through, Joan of Arc and people like this. And you had some wise things, and the Christianity kept learning going. It preserved the old books. So it was a plus and a minus. But in the end, what you ended up with is a civilization with juvenility into adulthood. And Terence talked about this a lot too, where because you have no initiation, because you put people in church pews, or today in cubicles, or in classrooms, or in front of video games, stuff like that, they never get initiation, unless they go into scouting, or they jump out of airplanes, or they try to find, or they go to Burning Man, they try to find some way to initiate themselves out of juvenility into this opening awareness. They will never get initiated. So you end up with leadership, like they said, Donald Trump is an uninitiated juvenile, right? You get this really terrible, destructive forces in the world with uninitiated adults. And so in the 60s, with the discovery of the ergot, smut-derived LSD, that was a kind of informal, strange explosion of initiation that occurred, whether it be at rock festivals or, whether it be in, at the Fillmore or something. It somehow opened the Western mind, which is a very juvenile mind, especially out of the 1950s. These kids that had really great upbringings in the suburbs suddenly got slammed by this thing, this light, and my God, within 18 months between about 1966 and 68, it was like this Eleusinian return was underway. It couldn't sustain, right? But it was happening 50 years ago this year. Right now, it was happening 50 years ago, the summer of love and all that, and it was like the first crack. It was like the first return of a little piece of the Telesterion Temple. And I have a piece of the Telesterion here somewhere that Nick Herbert gave me, sitting here. Oh, here it is. Would you like to see it? And then I'll stop blabbing here. Let you talk. Okay, so you can see it on camera. So this was a friend of his gave him this, and this is, see the guy there? He's a festival dude, right? He's got really tripped out. He's in the festival, and so this is a bunch of acorns from around Eleusis, from the tree, maybe like the tree that that Persephone and her mother were under. But this little piece here is actually a seashell. Put it in my hand, it'll be easier to see. It's a seashell, but it's a fossilized, like lithified seashell from the base, the lowest part of the foundation of the temple at Ulysses. And it was gifted to Nick, and he knew I was telling this story, so I brought this to LIB to hold it up and to let people touch it, because this was from the actual foundation of that building. So it was really something. I feel emotional just touching it, actually. I haven't taken it out in a year. But that was what this guy was up to, you know. See, doesn't he look cool? Totally. He's a total festival goer. So where we are now is in this strange time where we have all this technology, you know, and we have all this media, and we have all this craziness, and we have this blend of the corporation, the church. They have crazy religions, these Abrahamic religions, which are all nuts. They're all off track, right? All of them. There's no exception. Whether it be any of the Abrahamic religions are off track, right? By definition, because they have no connection with any kind of a magic. You know, go into the Vatican and you'd find not a single one of those cardinals had any spiritual experience, because they wouldn't be the way they are. You know, Pope Francis, who's kind of a breath of fresh air, he lives in like the garage. He doesn't want to live in the papal apartments. He lives in the guest house above the garage. And he wrote a piece for the Italian news called "The 7 Diseases of the Curia," you know, that's the cardinals, and that's the Curia is the sort of the bosses. And the 7 diseases of the Curia include laziness, backbiting, politics, lack of any discipline whatsoever, gluttony, blah, blah, blah. And then he's talking about the cardinals. He's talking about the former pope who's still living there. Cardinal Ratzinger is still there. And so these guys have nothing going. There's nothing going on there. They have not had a spiritual opening. They've not seen the light. They've not done any personal healing. It's just a big, corrupt, inefficient, stupid bureaucracy. There's nothing going on there. There's nothing going on in Islam at the high levels. There's the occasional Sufi, there's the occasional mystic, but it's just a big, ugly, they call it the Walmart of Islam, Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. It's horrible. In Judaism, Judaism is no paragon either. It's full of words. It's full of blame and pain and too much story. It's rare to find anybody in a formal position that they oppress women. Judaism's a monster in a lot of ways too, and to some extent, Buddhism is too. There's this film about how they treat blind children in Nepal, who are considered to be carrying a curse. There's a lot of problems. Any organized, structured, so-called spiritual belief becomes a monstrosity, and with very little connection to anything that's profound at all. But then there are these little openings. There's this little fragments, because it comes through human beings. But we could certainly do without all those structures. We could do without corporatism and consumerism and religiousism and all these rabbit holes. And now there's conspiracy theory and there's fake news and all that, and that's just more of the same nonsense. And so where do you go from here? If you're filling the minds of the monkeys with all this junk, where you go is you go back to initiation. But where we're going with initiation with, say, psychedelics or even Vipassana is not being done right. There's no lesser mystery. There's no preparation. often. I mean, people go to Vipassana retreats, and they're not, a lot of them are not prepared for the intensity of what happens, or the intensity of what happens in energy work, or in a psychedelic session. You know, they're not. The ancient world kind of knew what to do. The women and the hierophants that ran the temple knew that these people who walked in the door had to be prepared for months or even potentially years to come to that experience, so that it would land. They wouldn't get spun out, you know. But we take maybe minutes to prepare. We read a tweet or a web page, and we go into it, and we get, you know, most people get spun out. And so it's working for some, but it's not working for many. So in a sense, there's this conundrum of we have the greatest tools. You have the greatest tools in on the history of human beings to do spiritual work and do creative work and technological work, but our personal discipline and our way we live spins us out so that we get lost all the time. You know, there's no central channel. There's no place people come back to and know who they are. They're just constantly pushed here and here by a tweet or media or an opinion or a financial thing, or they take too strong of a whatever. They go over here. And so the monkeys are just going all over the place. And if there is Gaia, if there is an Ineffable, they're probably looking down at the kindergarten that is human beings, and there's just complete mayhem in the kindergarten. They're getting ready to probably say, time out, you know, everybody just sit down and try to calm the situation down. So anyway, that's the end of my spun out story on.
Yeah, no, that was beautiful. I really appreciate the expose on what a disservice the Christian Revolution played to the entire development of humanity, and the reference to, like I mentioned earlier, like LSD is the return of the light, or at least what was going on in the Summer of Love. I know for me it was definitely a return to the light, but like you said, my initiation, like the initiation of many people, was without those lesser mysteries to really bring me forth. And there's been a lot of sort of calamity and chaos in trying to sort all that stuff out, which, as I said to you earlier, in honoring and acknowledging what you're doing here with your work as a storyteller, as well as the other areas of high level science and astronomy and all these other things that you're doing. But as a storyteller, is really helping sort of give those lesser mysteries just a little bit, not in maybe direct practice, but in sharing the experience and allowing people to access a piece of it in being present to the altered state of participating in storytelling. And the idea, where are the monkeys going now, leads me into sort of the next phase of this interview, which is that I'm curious about space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the final frontier, and I have to admit that I don't really know a lot about outer space. I have I've seen Cosmos, both versions, and I know Star Trek and Total Recall and Firefly, and I've read The Void Captain's Tale and Ender's Game, and I have some idea of the solar system, that Pluto's no longer a planet, and some premise around these things. But I only have that illusion of understanding, that I have a very limited amount of information, which then synchronizes with itself so nicely that it gives me the illusion of understanding. So I'm going to sort of, as in this last section, lean into you in a fuller understanding, lean into your knowledge. And I want to prod about where are we in science and philosophy around our relationship to space travel, and even extraterrestrial life? Like, what has your attention right now? What's inspiring for you? Where are we going?
Well, I'm, I live partly in the very hardcore materialist, reductionist world of engineers attempting to send missions to other worlds. And so I'm very much a follower of what's the ground truth. That's a NASA term called ground truth. Truth on the ground. Like Neil Armstrong standing in the moon, there was a certain ground truth to the reality of that. So there are many stories that are told about space. Most of it's sort of just made up in people's heads. But when you actually work with people who send missions out, you find that it's a much more interesting story than all the made up junk, like the flat Earth or the, mystery planets or things like this. It's just made up in people's heads. But when you look, for example, on where we should go on Mars to look for life, I was just at a meeting in Pasadena. There were 280 people in the room, and I had to do a talk with our team that's arguing to go to Columbia Hills, which is a part of Mars that we actually have a rover at now, to go and look for signs of life, because there's an old hot spring that was discovered, an ancient hot spring about 3.7 billion years old. And I go to Australia with a team of geologists to look at ancient hot springs that preserve the oldest signs and the oldest evidence for life on Earth. And I could actually show you one of these rocks if you want me to bring one in. Do you like to see one? I'll just go grab it. Might as well. We showed you the other rock. We'll show you this one. Okay, so you there? Yeah, I'm back. So this one, I'll show you two. This is from a lakeshore 2.7 billion years ago. And if you look at the little textures, see the little sort of folds? Those are called stromatolites. And they're basically biofilms that form and sequester sand grains together, and that we see the remnants of those grains in these folds. And this is sort of like a mudstone, but it's made by living systems. And then here's a much older one. This is, you can see that. This is the mineral barite. See how shiny it is? It's sort of a shiny mineral. And in the barite are these red nodules. And those are stromatolites 3.5 billion years old that are preserved in stromatolite. And this is from a hot spring locality in what's called the Dresser Formation in Australia. This is ground truth. This is the oldest evidence for our ancestors or for life on Earth ever found. That's convincing, that's extremely well preserved, and there's a lot of this there. And so this is like a teaching stone. It's like the philosopher's stone that Terence used to talk about. And those things are so interesting. The story that they tell is so interesting compared to what we make up in our heads. That that's why I think science is the greatest story for humanity. And you don't have to read dry papers. You can go to Australia and touch these things, and they will talk to you. They are the ancestor. And all around you are Aboriginal petroglyphs, some of them up to 60, 70,000 years old in the same landscape. And that's some of the oldest representations of human intelligence. That's a long time. And so our ancestors were beautifully, intimately connected with that land. In fact, the Aboriginal culture was one of the most mature cultures in the history of human beings. I don't think they went to war. I think they honored their boundaries. They had their song lines, and they had their they really fit the land. They were really in unity with the landscape, the Aboriginal people. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Europeans came in and, completely swept that away.
Treated them like beasts. Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, and just abused the landscape in a way that we seem to have done everywhere. Mm-hmm. But, we bring technology that allows biology to continue to evolve. So if you look at the whole picture, in a way, human beings are just another tool of evolution, right? Where we do amazing things. We stress the planet. We change the climate. We create a new biota, which is cities, which have new kinds of animals, in it. And here's an example, James, for you of how totally radically human beings have changed the biosphere already, that it's a done deal. So 20,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, just after the caves of Lascaux, human beings plus their pets and their livestock comprised maybe 2% of the biomass of vertebrates, things with backbones we have. Now, we are 98%. Us Whoa. And our cows and our pets, and we're 98% of all vertebrates. So the bird in the picture behind you, that beautiful wild bird, is down in that 2% of vertebrates that is not part of the human world. And in some sense, crows in cities, they're part of the human world. I mean, they live off cities, but wild animals are down to just a couple percentage of left, and that includes vertebrates like fishes. I mean, doesn't include beetles, but
I'm thinking about the sort of catastrophe theories on how life unfolded on the planet, such as like being hit by massive asteroids, introducing bacteria and fungi, and possibly, I can't remember the author's name, but theories like the worlds in collision, and how
Velikovsky,
yeah, and that we are now having our biome radically changed by catastrophe, but it's us implementing the catastrophe. So these strombolites, that's how you pronounce them, right?
Stromatolites.
You're hoping that you will find something like that on Mars.
Yeah, the chance of us finding that, that's called a rock texture, a rock fabric, that's indicative of life in the past. The chance of finding that on Mars is really small, because generally geologists will take samples and they go back and they cut them into these thin sections and they look for evidence there, and they look for the chemical evidence. But perhaps hot springs are the only place we have a shot at finding life, because Mars, if life started on land in a hot spring environment, was driven into its living state, then it would have started on Mars that way. Mars had oceans, it had wet climate, about the same time the Earth did, and it would have had lots and lots of bubbling hot springs everywhere. It very shallow oceans. And then Mars started to dry out. So it didn't have a big iron core, so it didn't have a big magnetic field. So the solar wind just came and swept the atmosphere away. So it's almost a vacuum there now. It's not like Total Recall. I mean, when those guys, when their spacesuit mask was broken, they wouldn't be gasping for air. I mean, they were almost at a pure vacuum. They would just simply die in a horrible way right off the bat. Their eyes, they would, no, there wouldn't be, I think it would just be super quick, because it's like suddenly your entire system's exposed to a vacuum. So Mars was dying. So in this period called the Noachian, into another period called the Hesperian, the oceans were evaporating. The surface sort of mummified. It turned into this desiccated, dry planet with polar ice caps. that occasionally probably have melting events. But then underground, there would have been very salty water trapped, sort of brines, like pickle juice. I mean, in the rocks. So if life started in a hot spring, like we saw with that rock, vibrant life in a hot spring, it would have, as the surface died and became uninhabitable, it would have gone through the plumbing down and survived in the rock underground, which Earth has a lot of microbes in rock, even miles down. So there was what it would be. And then over the period of Mars history, there would be springs occasionally coming up and drying out as the material flows off, or the ice cap is melting. And you'd find some of these refugia, some of these refuge-seeking life would come up and for a period of time have some activity at the surface, but probably not photosynthetic, mostly eating the chemicals from the rock. And so extremely limited biology, limited metabolism, possibly not even enough to make those rock textures, So it's a tough one. So if Mars had life on a dying planet, it didn't have a pathway forward. It just went underground. We may not be able to see it. We have to drill extensively, and so it's tough to find life there.
So it's possible that the hollow Earth theory is actually a hollow Mars theory, and that's where we're going to find the Martians that are in control of the higher dimensional capacities of the human being.
The hollow Earth theory isn't a theory; it's another piece of nonsense from somebody's imagination. But yeah, Mars might have refugia of life. It's been proposed that the moons of Saturn, Europa, Enceladus, have these ice plumes coming off through cracks in the ice. This is a big ocean. Then there's like 10 or 20 kilometers of ice, and some of that ocean materials is being blasted out. And one of my colleagues is involved in designing an instrument to fly through that plume and sample those little grains of icy grains and turn them into, try to see if there's any kind of polymers there or any kind of things that are precursors to life or evidence for life. But Dave and I both believe that life can't start in a continuous watery ocean, because you can't do the chemistry without drying things down. You need to dry things down in order to make the chemistry work. And so, but maybe life came later to, say, Enceladus, but you couldn't start there. So that's an interesting discussion within the NASA community and the sort of life missions community now as to, will we find any evidence at Enceladus, or will we find any evidence on Mars? I think we won't turn up evidence in either place. That's my personal. It's such a needle in a haystack. It took 100 years to identify the stromatolites in Australia as being, biogenetic and understanding what they were. It took 100 years, and geologists climbing everywhere and making arguments at meetings, and then finding living stromatolites that are today, and then figuring out how they made those towers, those layers. It took 100 years to make that case, with enormous amounts of samples and data. So I think we're not going to really find anything. I think if humans go there, and human geologists, and with full labs, we could probably get closer, but I think that's decades in the future for Mars. It's just impractical.
So I want to switch gears a little bit from biology into technology. We have the emergence of SpaceX, which possibly promises us weekend retreats to the overseer effect. And I'm curious where you're at, since you have been helping to design spaceships. And to explore this, I've got a couple questions from some of my patrons through Patreon. And I'll go ahead and ask them. Two from Eduardo. The first one is, I would ask Bruce if he sees the design and development of interplanetary technology and space engineering as a major wave of energy towards a fully automated, sustainable, and renewable energy source evolution of humanity.
So say that again.
Okay, so I would ask Bruce if he sees the design and development of interplanetary technology and space engineering as a major wave of energy towards a fully automated, sustainable, and renewable energy-sourced evolution of humanity. So moving into the next evolution of us as a regenerative, sustainable species.
Yeah, I think there's a quick answer to that, which is human beings are showing no signs of slowing down our rates of consumption of energy and materials. We're getting more efficient, but we keep having babies, and those babies want to have their cell phones or their AR systems or whatever. And so any future child born now will use like hundreds of times more potentially materials in their lifetime than, let's say, a child born in 1950. So it's just going and going and going. So the only way we can keep from hitting this tight barrier is to expand civilization and the biosphere vastly into the solar system. And that's why we came up with the Shepherd spacecraft with Peter Janiskins from the SETI Institute, who's a meteor astronomer, and with Julian Knott, who's the world's leading balloon designers. We came up with this idea 3 years ago of extending a balloon structure around an asteroid and sealing the end and never touching the asteroid, because you can't touch these things. You can't mine them that way or put cables around them because they'll just come apart, destroy your mission.
Yeah.
But then you introduce gas and it will slow, say, the tumble of the asteroid down and stop it in gas friction. And then you steer it with gas. Like a sailing ship, you blow a wind at it and it'll rotate and it'll start to move very, very gently in a new direction. And you can change the orbit and bring these things to lunar orbit or Mars orbit. And while you're transporting them, you can heat the interior and melt the gas, the ice, those are called volatiles, and suck them off and fill tanks full of water and methane and various things. So you can get fueling stations everywhere. You can also get the nickel out of them using carbonyl gas and do 3D printing of objects inside the container, inside the enclosure. And then you can create biospheres. You can melt them into a bubble, a sort of luminous bubble that you light from inside and create a biosphere that you can then harvest consumables from. So Shepherd solves all three major problems of extending civilization into space. Consumables and fuel in bulk, large parts to build clean structures, because you're not going to put a lot of people on the moon or Mars. It's just the environment's too harsh. It's not a practical place to build, to extend civilization. It's practical to build large structures in space where they're clean and have a lot of energy. And then the biosphere will become your food source and for other chemicals and materials like we always do. So Peter and Julian and I realized we'd come up with potentially a single invention that can lead to the opening of the solar system. And that if that was invested in, and I'm going to go talk to the Chinese next, because NASA is probably not the right agency. Elon doesn't have the power to really do anything this visionary, but maybe the Chinese have the staying power to do it, and they have the economic driver. If they want to dominate the solar system economy in the 21st century, this is the invention that will get them there. It's almost like if you were the inventor of the first train, which was Stephenson and Isambard Kingdom Brunel invented this first steam trains. And then they invested and they built networks of rail in Britain and big sheds that ended up becoming train stations and fueling with coal. And those guys ended up changing the world, right? And this is what China could do in the railroads into space in some sense.
And so you see a future for harvesting energy and materials from outer space. Like that is the evolution of the technology. Do you feel like we're going to, as an extension of our technological advancement, that we're going to get to a place where we'll be able to live on our current planetary biome in a sustainable way without having to ultimately just spread our consumption off planet?
I think that the chance of humans, especially driven by corporatism and consumerism and militarism, the chance of humans sort of waking up and starting to get sensible, like having only one child, for example, per family, that's number one. Mm-hmm. Being much more conservative in the way they live and they consume, much more aware. The chance of that is very low. So the probability of people waking up and changing their behaviors is pretty low. So you got to have your eggs in these two baskets. So the other option is to allow the system to keep growing. Mm-hmm. And so investing in the keep growing option is a safety valve, because if say, for instance, in the year 2200, we have 500 million people living in the solar system in very, very well-maintained biomes, in a sense. We will learn how to manage the Earth. They will have the overview effect you mentioned earlier, and we will see the Earth as just another biosphere. And if we see that it's messed up, well, we've learned how to make biospheres. We've learned how to reproduce Gaia, in a sense, make biospheres in the solar system. So it's like, oh, the Earth's really messed up. It looks like Wall-E, all the trash is built up.
Yikes.
We know how to fix that because we have, we'll have the ability to really repair the damage we did to the Earth quite easily, because we'll have access to resource and energy, and we'll understand how to live in basically big biospheres. And so the Earth will get plucked out of the fire in the 2300s, because we're like, yeah, heck, what a mess that was made, but we can refit that rainforest, and we can start reducing the population pressure on Earth and allowing some of the biosphere to regenerate.
By breeding in space.
Well, by basically saying, we don't like those messy, dirty, smelly, crowded cities on Earth anymore. We've just built this enormous, beautiful complex here, and people just decide what they make their choice. They vote with their feet. But now we're spread out everywhere. So we're not going to have a thermonuclear war that will destroy the whole world, because there's lots of worlds. And it's not a surface colony on Mars, because those will be sort of tough environments. But it'll be these Jerry O'Neill type biospheres, which we can build out of resources. Because you've got 1 billion times, just in these objects floating in space, call them NEOs or asteroids or old cometary nuclei. You've got billions of times of the resource: water, amino acids, carbonaceous materials, metals, that are available. And those are your building blocks for doing anything you want to do. And that's what we're made out of. And the origin of life itself came because some of those were raining down on the Earth when the Earth had just formed, and fed those little warm pools and made us. And they made the little protocells that created the progenote. And so in 1,000 years, if you were to look at the solar system, and you'd see all these little encapsulations, little spheres around trillions of these objects that are just harvesting them or growing around them, it's exactly the same process as the origin of life. It's encapsulation around these rich resources and cycling. And then the expansion of Gaia, or whatever you'd call it, into the solar system looks the same as the origin of life. And actually, I sent a vision back to the progenotes one day. I said, hey, guys, if Shepard flies and it fills with that gas coming out of that asteroid, it's you drinking from that resource, and you guys are going to work all this overtime and help clean our world to create us. Well, it was worth it, because we got sense in our heads. We got initiated again. we open our minds to greater future and vision and the light, and we decide to take on the project of projecting you forward after all the hard work, overtime hours. And life's going to go on. It's going to go on for 1 million years. And there's many worlds. It's not just Earth. There are thousands of worlds now for evolution to continue. And that's what a great mission for human beings. It gives us a purpose, finally,
Other than the animalistic ones of reproduce and consume. So I want to move into the next question from Eduardo.
And then we'll have to finish up because I've got to get on the road in about 10 minutes.
Sure.
So Eduardo, yes.
Actually, I'm going to move into this next question, which will be the last question from Abby, which is, would be neat to hear Bruce talk about potentially suppressed technologies and if he believes whether or not there is a degree of corruption and politics in his field of expertise.
I don't believe in any suppressed technologies. I think the people, what you should always do if somebody puts something forward that has a little bit of the sense of like there's a big sort of evil force that's unidentified that is doing something in the world, that should set off your alarm bells. Because what you do then is you say, okay, this smells like a conspiracy theory, right? They're easy to detect. They have certain properties. There's like books been written about these things. You should then become skeptical of the proposer or the presenter. Now, most people who present these things are just passing it on through social media. They have no idea. But if you go back to the original person who came up with this, like say there's probably a chemtrails guy, right, that cooked all this stuff up. And you find out they're not an expert in atmospheric science either. They know nothing. And where are their published papers in the literature? Where is their understanding? And then you find a cooked up Photoshop image. And then you say, okay, number one thing is be skeptical of the proposer. Don't believe anything right off the bat. And that's a good Canadian approach, actually. Canadians are far more skeptical. Americans just sort of believe anything. I don't know how that happened. They just believe all this nonsense.
It's how they were conditioned.
It's how they were conditioned. So in a sense, so anything like a suppressed technology, the proposer of that is to be disbelieved immediately. I think it was Carl Sagan that said, if you have an extraordinary claim, then you have to come up with even more extraordinary evidence. That. And that's it. Otherwise, you get spun out and you lose your ground and you don't start not knowing what is real and what isn't. And those are the forces that are sort of pulling the monkey brain apart. And you don't want to be playing that in that game. You don't want to get all spun out.
Totally agree. Do you think you have time for just one more question? I think
sure. Yeah.
Given the answer to that last one, I think this next one might be a bit easy for you to answer and quick. So finally from Eduardo, what do you think are the chances that we can run into remnants of other space explorers who have reached our technological advancement or beyond ours in this solar system?
I think that the chance is pretty much zero. Now, you may, in a dream or on an elixir, feel you've had a contact with, an entity, but that's a whole different game than physical artifacts. Terence always talked about if he could only bring one of these magical objects back from the machine elves were creating, if he could only do that, and it would come into the world, and even with good 3D printing, he probably couldn't do that. But really, then you have to go back into the ground truth of the thing, which is probably technological, using bearing civilizations are extraordinarily rare. Complex life, plant and animal life is extraordinarily rare. Maybe biofilms are maybe more common. But on the Earth, when the Earth dies in the heat death of the sun in several billion years, if you look at the time that the Earth has had complex multicellular organisms, it will be just less than 1%. So it'll have biofilms, barely struggling at some point, finally turning on what James Lovelock calls Gaia, where it can control the temperature and the gas content. So then it does oxygenation of the atmosphere, and then then you get complex life 1%, and then the complex life goes away, right, for whatever reason, because of the heat curve of the parent star or something. And then there's biofilms all the way to the end. So in that tiny little bracket, you have to find just the right combination for intelligent complex life to ask questions and to build stuff, and then to want to go places. And even though there's all these exoplanets, I would put forth that complex life is extraordinarily rare, and thinking life that's willing to fund visionary nerds to go on, expeditions is even rarer, because I think most intelligent life would say, well, we're just here now. There's no past and there's no future. They'd be like what Ram Dass talks about, just be here now. And they're like, they're looking to us as like, well, these crazy monkeys, they think about the past and future and tell themselves crazy stories. Let them try to figure this out. We're not budging an inch. We're a colonial, multi-insectoid being that we don't need bus service. We don't need the internet, because we are the internet of our, why bother kind of thing. So in a sense, I think that the chance is zero of finding any actual artifacts, no matter what Hollywood likes to show us.
Great. Thanks so much for your time, Bruce. I really appreciate you coming here on the show. For the listeners, are there any places you would like to direct them to learn more about what you do and even to participate in more of your storytelling?
Yeah, thank you. Damer.com, www.damer.com. Damer.com is sort of my personal homepage. You can see the TEDx talks and the Levity Zone podcast, Levity Zone. So named because one night I think I was having a conversation with Terence, and I said, Terence, we have enough novelty. We need more levity. So that's in honor of him. But there's 60 episodes of various goodies there. And then the DigiBarn Computer Museum, if you want to see the history of computing. And we're getting ready to scan Timothy Leary's extant archive, which I have in the barn now. So that'll be the whole 70,000 pieces of articles and books and records and stuff like that. It's another way to look at the Eleusinian return of the 60s, because it's the best news archive that's existed. The rest of it the primary collection went to the New York Public Library in 2011, the manuscripts. So that's in there too, and that'll start rolling out this summer. I think Lex Pelger may be coming to help us do that scanning. He's like going to research every single article, including one I found from 1963 after Kennedy's address about going to the moon. And this article says, NASA to use LSD to train lunar astronauts.
Nice.
So
seems like it would make sense.
If that had happened, Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon, instead of saying some awkward test pilot kind of thing like one small step for man, would have stood there, meditated a moment on the whole totality, been there, saw the Earth rising, and he would have said to the camera, far out.
Yeah.
And the whole world, like 2 billion people watching, would have said, far out. It would have been a different world, but it still can be, The name of the podcast is ATTMind.
Oh, the name of the podcast, by the time this episode is released, will have shifted to Adventures Through the Mind, which is what ATTMind stands for.
Okay.
But it's terrible marketing. I might cut this little bit out, but it's terrible marketing, but it's Adventures Through the Mind podcast.
So I'll say it for you. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind podcast with James Jesso.
Thanks, Bruce.
Does that work?
Yeah, that's great.
And you can edit out the phone ringing, or maybe that was.
I'm not sure I can, but I'll try to mute the levels around that.
That was the Ineffable trying to call in.
Yeah.
The
Logos was trying to get represented, and we didn't answer the phone. We didn't answer the call.
That's right. And James Alan Watts was right. He was wrong in that you get the message, you hang up the phone. Well, the phone is calling you all the time, trying to give you the message, you know?
Yeah.
So, anyway, so let's refactor that one. And
Thank you for listening to parts 1 and 2, hopefully, or maybe just part 2 of episode 49 here with Bruce Damer on Adventures Through the Mind. I appreciate your continued listenership, and I also appreciate your tendencies towards jameswjesso.com/support to help contribute to the financial, the economic responsibilities of this podcast, and basically feeding into a larger surplus that will ultimately allow it to grow and better and enable me to eat more regularly, because this is my main gig. As always, the show notes, as well as everything that I do, which includes lectures and other videos and writing, is available at jameswjesso.com. Please subscribe to the podcast, and I will see you on the next episode, the official 50th of Adventures Through the Mind. Thanks.